Okay, welcome to another terrific program at the Merowitz Center. Thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Presidential Legacies series has turned out to be one of our most popular series, so welcome back if you've already participated. Thus far, we've featured Lincoln, LBJ, Truman, FDR, and Ford, as well as the First Ladies. This afternoon, we're featuring Eleanor Roosevelt, here to tell her story of the amazing human rights advocacy and activism that she was known for as Jeff Urbin, education specialist at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum. And before we turn this program over to Jeff, special shout out to Covenant Place residents and also my mom who is sitting in. So welcome everybody. Hope we have a lot of fun. Jeff, we're always happy to see you again, and you are definitely one of our favorites. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And Laura's mother, we got to talk. we got to talk. Thank you, everybody, for having me back. Thanks for coming in today. Today, we're talking a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt and also her work with the United Nations. And the thing I want to start off with is getting you to understand that the Roosevelts were really what I like to call futurists. These were people who were always looking out ahead about what they wanted the world to be like, what they wanted the world to look like. And this is really important because they were in power at very terrible times in American history, right? First, the Great Depression, then the Second World War. You had the Holocaust going on at the time. The president was unable to walk because he had polio, right? And so there was all these terrible things going on. But the Roosevelts always had optimism that things were going to get better. And they always saw where they were, took stock of what was going on, and then saw where they wanted to be. Saw the world the way they wanted it to be. And then they worked to build bridges from where they were to where they wanted to be. Sometimes they were able to complete those bridges all the way. Sometimes they were only able to lay some of the foundation, some of the framework for that, and the work would have to be picked up and carried on from there. And that's exactly what the United Nations and the Roosevelts is really all about. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt is known around the world in her own time and in ours as this tireless advocate for change, this advocate for getting things done, this advocate for people who were in need and were hurt. And she continues to inspire people now almost 60 years after her death. So, I think you'll be happy to know that it's not just adults such as ourselves that are interested in Mrs. Roosevelt, but young children, school-age children, all involved in the advocacy that Mrs. Roosevelt was pushing for. So that I find that very inspiring. Now, Eleanor herself had a pretty rough life. She was born October 11th, 1884, and she was born in New York, born into the Roosevelt clan, the actual Roosevelt side of the family, the Teddy Roosevelt side. And she had kind of a rough upbringing. Her mother referred to her as Granny. That was the nickname that her mother gave her, Granny, because she thought that she looked like a little old lady and acted like a little old lady. Her father was a neglected alcoholic. And what I mean by that is, he would promise her all these things and then completely not follow through. And the biggest story about that is one time he said, we'll go into New York. We'll do everything you want to do. We'll have a big day in New York, daddy-daughter day. And the day comes, and the first thing in the morning, he gets drunk and he leaves her sitting on a doorstep in New York, waiting for this day to begin. And it simply never does. She's passed around from family member to family member throughout the Roosevelt clan, never really finding a place to stay, never really finding a place to belong. Then she ends up with her grandmother in a place called Tivoli, New York, which is about 25 miles north of where I am here in Hyde Park. And there she has a very strict, mean grandmother who's taking care of her, and two alcoholic uncles who, for fun, will get drunk in the afternoon, open up the windows in the attic and shoot at Eleanor as she is on the property with a rifle. Now, not to hit her, but to scare the living bejeebies out of her. Okay, so if she's just come back from a horse ride and she's brushing down her horse, and the horse is maybe nibbling on some straw, then they would shoot into the pile of straw just to see the horse jump, just to see Eleanor jump as well. She goes over to Allenwood School, where she is introduced to the headmaster of the Allenwood School, and the headmaster there is a woman by the name of Madame Silvestri, and Madame Silvestri sees in Eleanor the attributes the rest of the world will see later on. And she begins to draw Eleanor out of her shell. Eleanor ends up marrying Franklin Roosevelt. She has a very domineering mother-in-law. Franklin cheats on her with his social secretary and promises he'll never see this woman again. But in fact, toward the end of his life, they reestablish a relationship, and she's actually with him when he dies in Warm Springs, Georgia. So this is the kind of life that Eleanor Roosevelt had. Even on her wedding, March 17th, 1905, she gets married to Franklin, and it should be the day that she's the center of attention, right? The bride is supposed to be the center focus of the wedding. And she asks her Uncle Teddy Roosevelt, the president, to walk her down the aisle because her father is dead by this point. And Uncle Teddy says, yeah, sure, I can do that. And he does it, and he steals away all the attention. Nobody was paying attention to Eleanor at her own wedding. She later said she felt like a bit player in her own wedding. So this is the life that Mrs. Roosevelt had. This is the life that Mrs. Roosevelt grew up in. And what this did was it turned her not into a bitter person, but into a very compassionate person. And she had a couple of major turning points in her life. The first turning point was when she goes to Allenwood School and she meets that Madame Silvestri. And Madame Silvestri sees in her for the first time what the rest of the world is going to see later on. She says to Eleanor, you are smart. Right? You are talented. You are bright. You have ideas. You have a great soul. You need to talk about this. You need to write about this. You need to engage with the other students. And this interaction with Madame Silvestri is the first major turning point in her life that gives her a sense of confidence and a sense of self-awareness. Right? Her mother calling her granny instills in her mind for the rest of her life that she's awkward looking, that she's awkward acting, that she is awkward when she's out in front of people. And this is an image of herself that she then carries on with the rest of her life. Madame Silvestri helps to blunt some of that by instilling this sense of confidence and this sense of self-awareness. After the Roosevelts are married, shortly, within 10 years or so, Franklin has an affair on Eleanor with her social secretary. And when she finds out about this, Eleanor says she feels as if the bottom of her world has fallen out. And she offers Franklin a divorce. And Franklin says, no, let's work this out. Well, we don't need to get divorced. And the reason was because he had two people that were advising him. One was Louis Howe, his political advisor. And Louis Howe said, are you crazy? If you get a divorce, your political career is over. We're talking the 19-teens, right? So the idea was, listen, if you can't run a marriage, how are you going to run a country? You can't run a marriage. How are you going to represent, you can't represent yourself in a marriage. How are you going to represent yourself in a Congress or in a Senate? And so politically, he would have been dead. But more importantly, his mother, Sarah, Franklin's mother, Sarah, said, there'll be no divorce in this family, pal. Okay, you found this woman, you married this woman, you were in love with this woman, you cheated on this woman, you need to make it right. And if you don't, I'm cutting you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. And that's exactly the way it worked out, that she said, hey, you can go have your fun, but you're not going to have any of the money to do it. And so they end up staying in the marriage. And at that point, the marriage stops being the lovey-dovey, marriage and cutesy pie stuff that you would hope among two people. And it becomes really more of a machine, right? Like two pistons working next to each other in the same piece of machinery, getting the job done. That's what ends up happening. So the affair that Franklin has with Eleanor's social secretary, in a way, becomes a point of leverage and independence for Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, I'm not taking away from the fact that he shouldn't have cheated on her, right? That's not good. Everybody knows that. But what it did was it gave her a sense of leverage and a sense of independence. Because now, if she was doing something and he didn't like it, she could literally say to him, hey, listen, pal, you wouldn't even have a political career, right? If it wasn't for me, right? If you had divorced me, you would be done, okay? I decided to stay with you. I'm making this work. And so guess what? I'm going to go do what I want to do. And by having this relationship of sort of the two pistons, right, within the same piece of machinery, getting the job done, what this did was it freed Eleanor from the emotional and probably sexual, though we don't know, but certainly from the emotional side of the marriage, right? She no longer had to be that, social, emotional, intimate side for Franklin. And she was able to use that energy on her other interests and other things as well. Now, in 1921, Franklin Roosevelt contracted polio, and he was unable to walk. He came back here to Hyde Park, and for 7 years tried to teach himself how to walk again. During that 7-year period, Franklin sent Eleanor out all across the state of New York, all across the country, to make speeches on his behalf, to write articles, to make personal appearances, all on his behalf. And by doing this, Mrs. Roosevelt gained a bunch of valuable skills. This was another turning point. So when he contracted polio and she had to sort of literally step to the plate to keep his name alive in politics, she was able to begin to make political connections with people all over the state and all over the country, because she was traveling around, visiting with people, making speeches, doing talks, making presentations. And she created a nice network of helpers that come in very handy later on when she's trying to get things that she wants to get done. She also develops her public speaking skills. Mrs. Roosevelt understood that she had that high, sort of squeaky, annoying voice. And so she was told, stand up, say what you have to say, and then sit down. And so she developed, rather than this long, drawn out, blabbity speaking style, much more concise, much more direct. She also developed her writing skills because she was writing letters. She was writing speeches. She was writing reports. And all of these become very important political skills that she's able to develop. The networking, the political skills, the public speaking skills, and the writing skills. So the 1921 polio attack gives her basically 7 years of going out there and developing those skills. Now, Franklin returns to politics, first as the New York State governor, which was always a sort of stepping stone to the presidency. And he's governor here for 2 terms, and then he decides to run for president. Mrs. Roosevelt does not want him to run for president, right? She doesn't want to be first lady. She doesn't want to be in the public eye, but she understands that this is what Franklin wants. This is what Franklin is living for. And so he runs in 1932 against Hoover. They win in a landslide, and suddenly Mrs. Roosevelt is First Lady of the United States. And she said in her writings later on that she had the most horrible feeling when she was told that Franklin had won. She was happy for him that he had gotten the dream that he was looking for, but she was completely and totally unhappy for her because she knew what it meant. So what she did was she turned this, this inconvenience for her, let's say, into a political asset. And the asset was that she now had access to power. She had access to power from arm's distance, which is very, very important because she, was First Lady. She had access to the president. Not only the president, but the president who was a very active president, got a lot of stuff done, tried to make things happen, and was president for not one, not two, not three, but almost 4 terms. So she had access to power, very close access for a very extended period of time with a partner who was willing to listen, willing to work, and willing to push things forward. But her access was once again at arm's distance. So what this did was it allowed her to push the president without having to endanger his political career. So what I mean by this is, as First Lady, she has no real power, right? The First Lady is not in the Constitution. You just happen to get a First Lady when you get a president if they're married. So she used this as sort of the bully pulpit. She used this as a way to get Franklin to do what she thought he should be doing. But she didn't have to bear any of the political burden on that because nobody was voting for her. They were voting for him. So she becomes First Lady, and the first thing she discovers is that women are not allowed to attend the president's press conferences. There are no women allowed at the press conferences. So Mrs. Roosevelt says, that ain't fair. And what she does is she says, I'm going to have my own press conferences, and I'm not going to allow men to show up. So she has these press conferences, and she only allows women reporters. This was very important for women in journalism because if during the Depression, if you wanted to save money, the first thing you did was fire the women, right? Oh, they'll go get married. They don't, they shouldn't be in the job market anyway, right? This was the attitude at the time. So the idea was, if you want to cover the First Lady of the United States, who's going to be out there making things happen, you have to have female reporters on your staff because they're the ones that are going to be able to get there and be able to, report about what it was that she was doing. Now I see we have a question here from Bill. Bill wants to know, how did she explain Franklin's absence when she was speaking on his behalf for 7 years? Well, everybody knew that he had polio. But people did not know how badly it impacted him and affected him, and so because of that, she was able to sort of say, well, Franklin can't be with you today because he's got issues with his legs or he's busy. And, because the world was a much bigger place back then, you didn't have social media, you didn't have news coverage, from coast to coast the way you do today. She was able to parcel out that 7 years without people really piecing it together and putting it together. And, she was basically able to say, well, he's not here today because he's busy, or he's not here today because, he wasn't up to it today, but I'm here instead. And they were able to parcel that out over the course of that entire 7-year period until he comes back and runs for governor in the state of New York. So she has the very first press conferences for her First Lady, and she only allows female reporters. She travels 144,000 miles on her first year as First Lady, as the president's eyes, ears, and legs. So now, as First Lady, she's going around the country. Before, she was just speaking on behalf of this, prominent politician wannabe. Now she's speaking on behalf of the President of the United States. And it's through this 144,000 miles in the first year that she really begins to meet with ordinary, common people as well. And she sees how the Great Depression, she sees how racial injustice, she sees how sexism and many of these other, social ills are impacting real live people every single day. And she comes back to the president and she reports these things. So, hey, look, here, these programs, they're not helping people of color. These programs, they're not helping women. You know that in the 1930s in contracts in this country, if you were a female and you were a teacher, they put in your contract that you could be a teacher so long as you didn't get married. If you were married, you were expected to resign because then that job would open up for somebody else. If you had a husband, let him take care of you. We need these jobs. So these are the kinds of things that were going on at that time. She started to write a My Day column And she wrote it every day except Sunday from 1935 all the way on up to 1962. And her My Day column, some people claim it was the world's first blog, right? Because she was basically writing every day about what it was she was doing. And she would talk about simple things like, went to the market today, got some beefy boy tomatoes. Boy, were they good when we had them for lunch, simple, sublime stuff like that. The next day, oh, was at the British Palace with the Queen, and we talked about this or that. So whatever was going on in her day, she was sharing that with people and bringing them in to the presidency, bringing them into the administration for the very first time. And this made the Roosevelts much more effective because people felt that they had a stake in the White House. People felt that they had a friend, that they had a connection with somebody in the White House. She traveled to England 2 times during the war. And this was very important because what it showed our British allies was that we are so behind you and we are so confident that we're going to be able to beat the Nazis and win this war that we are willing to send our First Lady to England, just 30 miles off the coast of occupied Nazi Europe. So the fact that she went there and visited was a huge boost to people in terms of their confidence and such in terms of their morale in the war. She also traveled throughout the South Pacific on a 30,000-mile morale boosting trip in the South Pacific, visiting American sailors and soldiers and little islands all across the South Pacific. And again, this had a huge morale boost. Right here, these guys are fighting in the far off corners of the world. They don't think anybody is knowing what they're doing. Nobody remembers them. Nobody's thinking about them. All of a sudden, here's the First Lady of the United States. And during that trip, which lasted about 6 weeks, she lost nearly 30 pounds just by traveling around and doing what it was that she was doing. She took a lead on civil rights by resigning her membership in the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, when they wouldn't let Marian Anderson, an African-American singer, sing at Constitution Hall. This brought out a lot of publicity and a lot of attention to racial segregation. And there was a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday, 1939. 75,000 people attended the concert given by Marian Anderson. They wouldn't let her sing at Constitution Hall because it was a segregated venue, but they couldn't stop her from singing at the Lincoln Memorial. 75,000 people showed up. One very important person did not show up. That was Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt did not go to that concert because she knew that if she did, she would be the center of attention, right? Just the way Uncle Teddy was at her wedding. She remembered that lesson she learned on March 17th, 1905, that if you have a big celebrity at some place, they're going to steal all the attention and you're going to look like, fish food. And so when the concert came time for the concert on the Lincoln's Memorial steps, she stayed home because she wanted Marian Anderson to have her moment in the sun. She visited with the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American pilots who were told that they weren't smart enough to fly airplanes because they were Black. This goes back to a 1925 Army War College report. This was official United States government policy at the time. But Roosevelt said, well, let's give them a chance. Let's give them a shot. Let's see what they can do. And Mrs. Roosevelt was a big backer of them actually going and visiting, taking a flight with an African-American pilot. Secret Service almost flipped, right? It's like, wait, you can't get in there. These guys aren't supposed to be smart enough to know how to fly anything. She goes, she flies around, she comes down, she lands, and she says, these fellows can fly just as well as anybody. Huge step forward for the Tuskegee Airmen. And when the Japanese-American incarceration takes place during 1942, Mrs. Roosevelt speaks out against it. And she says, this is not right, Franklin. We can't do this. These are American citizens. They haven't done anything wrong. They are not the ones that were flying the planes. And the president says to her, Eleanor, we have to have a unified front on this. you cannot speak out about this anymore in public. And she says, okay, I won't in public, but she goes behind the scenes and she is talking about it all over the place. And she is advocating, and she goes and she visits many of the people that are in these camps, letting them know that she's working to try to end this, that she's working to try to improve conditions for them. This is the kind of person that Eleanor Roosevelt was. Now, in the next turning point comes for her on April 12th, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt dies, right? So she has a turning point when she meets Madame Silvestri, self-confidence, right? Self-awareness. She has a turning point when Franklin has the affair, because now she's got some leverage and independence in the marriage. She has a turning point when Franklin contracts polio, because she has to step to the plate to get his name out there, and she learns all these incredible skills. And she has the turning point when the president becomes president, because now she has direct access to power. She has a direct line, a direct pipeline to have influence in things that are going on in the country. The final turning point for her is when Franklin dies, because when Franklin dies, she is truly free to go about things on her own mission. And people encouraged her to run for office. You should run for office, Mrs. Roosevelt. And she never ran for public office. She did not want to be a mayor, a governor, a senator, anything like that, because she said, if I do, then I have to be responsible to my constituents. She did not want to be responsible to constituents. She wanted to be responsible to her own conscience. She did not have to worry about, oh, if I do this, what are the voters going to think? Oh, if I do this, are the voters going to support me? She wanted to do what she felt was right, regardless of whether people supported her, regardless of whether people, were going to vote in favor of her or not. She had her own agenda. And she begins to pave the way for other strong women moving along in that way. Now, when President Roosevelt dies, he's working on a very important project. And the project that he's working on is trying to create the United Nations. Now, during the war, during the entire Roosevelt administration, President Roosevelt had three basic goals throughout his entire term. So he's elected in 1932, he dies in 1945, and in that 12-year period, he had three major goals. The first goal was to save the American economy and thereby save democracy. Now that sounds like a grand statement, right? But keep in mind, 25% unemployment when he comes to office, 25% underemployment. People had jobs, but they weren't jobs that could pay enough to survive. There was calls for communism. There was calls for socialism. There was a call for the end of the United States government. There's a report that one time he was working in the White House in the Oval Office, and one of his aides came in order to sort of suck up to the president, the aide was like, oh, Mr. President, these New Deal programs, work. You're going to go down in history as the greatest president ever, right? Kind of stroking the boss's ego. And Roosevelt turned to him and said, and if they don't work, I will go down as the last president in American history. That's how bad things were. We don't think about it today. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. They'll put you in mind. So to save American democracy, he needs to save the economy. And so he starts the New Deal programs, and he begins to create jobs for people, and the economy begins to get better. That was goal number one. Goal number two was to stay out of World War II, right? Not get involved with what was going on in Europe, not get dragged into a second world war. The First World War was horrendous. 16 million people killed in the First World War. Roosevelt saw that sometimes up close and personal because he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And, he was over there in Europe a lot with what was going on. And when World War II begins, There's no stomach in America for getting involved in the war. And so he wants to stay out of it for as long as he can and as well as he can by making the supplies available to England, the supplies available to Russia through Lend-Lease, and let them have the material, let them have the equipment. Maybe they can solve it before we get into it. And he justifies this with a thing called the garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you can stand there with your fire hose and wait for the flames to hop over onto your house and then try to put out the fire. Or you can take the fire hose, unhook it, or the garden hose, unhook it, give it over to your neighbor and let them put the fire out over there before it even gets to your house. This was the rationale behind Lend-Lease. Well, the Japanese on December 7th, 1941, come and they attack Pearl Harbor, and that gets us into the war. So the goal of staying out of the war is no longer obtainable. So he shifts the goal from staying out of the war to decisively winning the war. This is very important, decisively winning the war. On December 8th, 1941, he gives his famous Day of Infamy speech. And he says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and unexpectedly attacked, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, he says, we will win on to absolute victory. So the very first day that we are in the war, he is talking about absolute, unconditional victory over the Axis powers. And the reason he insists upon this, and he gets some criticism for it later on in the war, is because he understands that at the end of the First World War, many of the seeds for the Second World War were planted at that time. Adolf Hitler was able to come to power by taking advantage of the resentment, by taking advantage of the anger, by taking advantage of the hatred that was left seething in Germany at the end of the First World War. Roosevelt says, we will not allow that to happen with the end of this Second World War. So he insists upon unconditional surrender. There's going to be no negotiating with the Nazis. We're going to kick Hitler's butt. We are going to defeat Hitler. We're going to defeat the Nazis. There's no making deals. There's no playing, footsie. It's going to be complete and total victory on our terms. And he sees that as critically important to maintaining a peace at the end of the Second World War. So goal number one, save America, save the economy, save American democracy. Goal number two, stay out of the war. Well, can't achieve that. So goal number three, let's win the war decisively. And as we get into the war and as we begin to, make progress in the war, which didn't happen, by the way, until 1943, right? When we got attacked in 41, we spent the rest of 41, which was only 3 weeks, all of 42 and into the first part of 1943, getting our butts kicked. It wasn't until 43 that the tide of the war began to turn. And we became what Franklin Roosevelt referred to as the arsenal of democracy. How were we able to become the arsenal of democracy? Because the New Deal programs had invested in American infrastructure. We had the roads, we had the railroads, we had the airports, the seaports, the electricity, the water pipelines, the electric pipelines, the sewer pipelines. We had the factories. We had entire populations of young men and women who had been put to work, who had work ethic, who understood how to work machines, who understood how to work as a team. And all these things are what helped us to be able to go from December 7th, 1941, being attacked by Japan, to becoming the arsenal of democracy by the end of 1942. Within 18 months, we were supplying 80% of the material being used by the Allies to fight the Nazis in World War II. So as we're fighting this war, Roosevelt develops a fourth goal. And the fourth goal is to prevent a third world war. Keep in mind, Roosevelt is Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. 16 million people are killed. He is Commander-in-Chief during the Second World War. 60 million people killed in the Second World War. And because he knows we are working on an atomic bomb, he understands that if there's ever a third world war and atomic weapons are used, hundreds of millions of people will die. So he has it as a major goal to prevent a third world war. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, you go about doing that by creating a world organization that can operate to help prevent having a third world war. And that is the United Nations. Now, let me show you some documents here that'll show you an interesting Roosevelt's thought processes on this as he's going through. So in 1943, as we begin to make progress in the war, he is at Tehran at a Big Three conference, and he starts to do this sketch. Now, you probably can't make that out too well. But what this sketch is the sketch for the structure of the United Nations. So you see it says, by FDR at Tehran, November 30th, 1943. There are 3 circles there. One says 40 UN, and that is the 40 nations that are going to be in the United Nations. Next is the Executive Committee, the ones directly under my fingers. And that is going to be the body that runs the United Nations. And then the third circle is the 4 policemen, which are going to be the countries that keep the peace in the world. And he envisions those being the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China. So what this is the basic structure for the United Nations. There will be 40 United Nations, a General Assembly, there'll be an Executive Committee, and there'll be a Security Council. And that's what he's talking about here. Underneath the 40 United Nations, he says there will be an ILO, which is an international labor organization. There will be a health organization and a food and agricultural organization. And the idea behind that is ILO, if we give people jobs, International Labor Organization, they are not going to get into trouble, right? If you have a job, someplace to be every day, then you have a structure to your life and you have a purpose. If you have health and you are able to do what it is that you need to do, then you are able to do what needs to be done. And what that does is it makes for a more stable economy, it makes for a more stable community. And if you have food and agriculture, if you are not hungry, if you're able to eat, then you are going to be less likely to suffer hunger, suffer disease, and suffer getting into trouble with things that you're not supposed to get into trouble for. Now, where does he come up with these ideas? Well, going all the way back to 1941, January 1941, right? This is before we are in the war. Franklin Roosevelt gives a speech before Congress on January 6th, 1941. So keep in mind, this is January 6th, 1941. We're not in the war until December, 11 months later, 1941. And Roosevelt gives one of the most important speeches in world history, I think. And it comes to be called the 4 Freedoms speech. And in this speech, the president says, I see a world based upon 4 fundamental freedoms. And this is so important because at this time, January 6th, 1941, Hitler is marching across Europe. The Italians are marching across North Africa. The Japanese are marching across the Pacific Rim. The world is at war. The world is falling apart. And the person who is leading that is none other than Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler has offered the world his view, his vision, his agenda, which is death, murder, destruction, genocide, slavery. That is the world that Hitler is bringing about. That is the world that Hitler is responsible for. And everybody was saying, oh, we gotta beat Hitler, we gotta stop Hitler, we gotta stop Hitler. but nobody was saying, then what? All right, let's say, God forbid, you have a heart issue, right? A cardiac issue, right? Oh, let's get you to the emergency room. Let's get you to the doctor, right? And we get you back on your feet. But then what? Well, you got to start exercising. You got to start eating right. You got to stop smoking. You got to stop drinking so much, right? You got to stop having so much stress. You have to do things in order to maintain that state of health. Nobody was asking about that at that time. They were just saying, we got to defeat Hitler. We got to defeat Hitler. Roosevelt was the only person really saying, then what? What comes next? Yes, we'll eliminate Hitler. We'll get rid of that world of death and murder and genocide and destruction and slavery. But what do we put in its place? And Roosevelt gives his famous 4 freedom speech. And he says, I see a world based upon 4 fundamental freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in their own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which basically means having enough food to eat, shelter, safety, those sorts of things everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear. The ability to feel as if this isn't going to fall apart again. The ability to believe in a future. The ability to believe in a world, a better place where we're going to be. And what Roosevelt does with this 4 freedoms speech is he offers the world an alternative narrative to the world of Adolf Hitler. That's why I say it's probably one of the most important speeches in world history, because had we gone down that road, had Hitler not been stopped, had Hitler been successful, imagine the world today. Now, we know the world is imperfect. We know there's all kinds of problems, but I believe that we are living in a much better world now than we would have had Hitler been successful. So Roosevelt offers up these 4 freedoms as a rallying cry for World War II and as a rallying cry for the peace after the war is over. And he's committed to this. Let me show you, and so here is a copy of his speech, and you can see the 4 freedoms, and he's made corrections as he's giving the speech, how he wants to give it. But basically, it's on page like 17 of the speech. He says, this is what we want to fight for. This is the world we want to live in. 4 fundamental freedoms. That's simple. Now, in January of 1941, just like 2.5, 3 weeks after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt says, we're going to have a conference. And he says, hey, all you nations that want to be united against Hitler, come to Washington and we'll form an alliance. Right? All you nations that want to be united against Hitler, come to Washington. We'll form an alliance. And so 26 nations come to the White House and sign an agreement to stand against Hitler. And this is the beginning in Roosevelt's mind of the United Nations. All you nations that want to be united, come and we'll fight. So this is a document from January 1942, right? Just 3 weeks after the attack at Pearl Harbor. It is the 26 nations listed out. And if you see there, second on the list says the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And underneath there, it says Canada, Austria, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. Those places, Canada, Australia, Newfoundland, New Zealand, excuse me, South Africa, and India were colonies of England. If this document had been created 200 years earlier, the United States would have been on there, the colonies of the United States. And these are all listed under England. Roosevelt takes his pencil and he moves those countries into where they need to be in alphabetical order. And when Churchill sees this, he almost poops a scone, right? Because what Roosevelt is doing with this document is he's disassembling the British Empire. He is saying, no, we are not fighting for the British Empire. We are fighting for 26 countries to be strong, independent democracies that will be a bulwark against Nazism, against fascism, against evil in the world. So he's thinking about the United Nations right from square one. He wants there to be a definitive victory because he does not want to have, this Nazi wiggle room for the end of the war. And he gets all of this set up, and there's going to be a big conference in San Francisco at the end of April 1945. And on April 12th, 1945, Roosevelt dies. The first decision that Harry Truman makes is we go on with the UN conference. He believed, as Roosevelt did, that we could not have a third world war. The stakes were simply too high. You couldn't go to war and wipe out an entire generation of people on the planet every 25 years. We need to put something in place to prevent this from happening. And so he agreed. He says, we're going to do it. We're going to go ahead with it. And one of the first delegates he appoints to the United Nations is none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. And he appoints Eleanor Roosevelt to be a delegate to the United Nations because of two reasons. Number one is he understands that we have to have this organization. And he understands that Mrs. Roosevelt understands suffering. She understands what it's like to be on the outside looking in. And at that point in the world, right, 1948, there are a lot of people on the outside looking in, right? England was under rations, food rations, all the way up to 1953. Right, the war was over for us. We came home, woo, and Betty Crocker, and you start all that sort of stuff. But much of the rest of the world was suffering the effects of that war 10, 15 years. Some of them are still after that war. And so there were a lot of people that were hurting in the world. And Truman understood, Mrs. Roosevelt understood that. And he also understood that she had the mantle of the Roosevelt name. She had worked hand in hand as that other piston in that machine, trying to get things done with Franklin Roosevelt. Who better to put on the committee and put on the delegation than the woman who was working hand in hand with the guy that was working to create the United Nations. And she gets on the United Nations, and she goes to she's put on a committee on human rights, and she becomes the chairwoman of the Human Rights Committee. And she seeks to, for the first time in world history, define what it means to be a human. Define what it means to have freedom. Define what it means to have human rights. What are your rights as a human being? And the committee works for over 2.5 years, and they finally are able to come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mrs. Roosevelt works for 2.5 years, 16-hour days, making sure that we can draft this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here is Harry Truman, a picture of Harry Truman and Mrs. Roosevelt with the United Nations flag. And Mrs. Roosevelt goes in there and she holds the feet to the fire. And she says, listen, we have to define what it means to be human. We almost wiped ourselves out. We almost destroyed the civilization of human beings on this earth. We cannot do that again. We need to lay out some rules on how we're going to behave. And she works to create this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I have here a draft of her copy, and the highlighted stuff. I know you can't make that out, but what she's done is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she has listed out Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. That people have a right to food, that people have a right to, from want, that people have a right from fear, that people have a right to free expression. You have a right to marry who you want to marry. You have a right to be a citizen in a country. You have a right to participate in your government. You have a right to move from one country to another. And this becomes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is passed unanimously and is in effect to this day. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt understood that this was what's called an aspirational document. Okay, this doesn't, you don't just pass this and now everybody's going to be nice to each other, right? That has not happened. We know that has not happened. But what this does is it puts everybody on alert as to what it means to be a human being. And it puts everybody on the planet on alert that there are human rights and that there is an organization that will be looking out for these things, and that there are other organizations that will be looking out for these things as well. This is not waving a magic wand and making everything happen just like that. It is an aspirational document. It is a goal for which human beings must strive. So it's kind of like you, right? When you say, oh, I want to get in shape for the summer. So I want to lose 30 pounds. You don't lose 30 pounds overnight and get in shape for the summer. You work at it. Okay, so you can think of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being your diet plan. I'm going to walk 2 miles a day. I'm going to have, 1 cup of coffee and 1 Danish, not 4 Danishes and 8 cups of coffee. I'm going to cut out, soft drinks. I'm going to cut out as much alcohol. I'm going to work toward these things. And if you do that every day in every way, you will be getting closer to that goal. Will you ever be your ideal weight? Probably not. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but let's just face it, right? You probably won't. But by working toward it, you will get closer to it. Mrs. Roosevelt once said, and these are my 2 favorite quotes of Mrs. Roosevelt, and then we'll open it up to some questions. Mrs. Roosevelt once said, "You don't have to become a hero overnight." And what that does is it gives you permission to fail. Right? You don't have to become a hero overnight. You don't have to drop 30 pounds between now and next Friday, okay? But if you're working at it, if you're nibbling away, if you're saying no to that second piece of cake, you are working toward your goal. You are a human being. You are going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. And when you do screw up, fess up, clean up, and move on, okay? Admit your mistakes, find out what went wrong, correct for them, and move on. You do not have to become a hero overnight. That statement gives you the power, it gives you the permission to make mistakes, because you will, because you're human. But it does not give you the excuse to say, well, I screwed up, it didn't work, I give up. No, can't do that. You got to keep moving forward. The second Eleanor Roosevelt quote, which is one of my other favorite, is that she says, human rights begin in small places. So small, in fact, they cannot be seen on a map or on a globe. And what that does is it gives us a superpower. It gives us a challenge. It says to us that you, right where you are, that me, right where I am, can begin to make the world a better place right now. You don't have to be a president. You don't have to be a king. You don't have to be a fancy first lady. All you have to do is be kind. All you have to do is be nice. Human rights begin in places so small they can't be seen on a globe or a map. They begin in your home. They begin in your place of work. They begin in your place of worship. They begin in your school. They begin in your neighborhood, in your community, in the things that you do each and every day. And we are not going to change the world overnight. We are not going to stop all war, all hunger, all aggression, all prejudice, or all of those things, like that. But we need to begin to work on it. And you don't need a big budget. You don't need a powerful army. You don't need a big fancy name. All you need to do is be nice and work on it. Help out where you are. Do what you can where you are. Mrs. Roosevelt always she said, I always try to do what I can, where I can, when I can, while I can. And if you do that, we're all going to be moving this world toward a better place. And all you need to do is get on your news feed, pick up your newspaper, and you can see there's a lot of need in this world. There's a lot of need right in your community. There's a lot of need right in your neighborhood. So let's get on it and let's start to make the world a better place, building upon the work of the Roosevelts and the work of Mrs. Roosevelt. Is the United Nations perfect? Absolutely not. But it is a place where we can go to talk about these things. It is a place where we can go to begin to make the world a better place. And much of what the United Nations does is not on the front page every day, right? Those health and food organizations are solving diseases all around the globe. They are feeding millions of people all around the globe. It's not making the headlines, right? But it's happening. It's working. And so we need to continue with that. So let's see, are there any other questions, comments?
Barb has a question. So go
I
ahead, Barb.
do. Actually, I have two questions.
Okay.
I'm from St. Louis, but I've moved to Sarasota. And here I met a young woman named Amy Ernst, who is the granddaughter of Max Ernst and the daughter of Jimmy Ernst, both famous painters. And she said, well, let me start really a different place and say thank you very much. I liked your talk. And I've always really admired Eleanor Roosevelt, and I've read a lot about her. So anyway, Amy told me something that was hard to square with the Mrs. Roosevelt I've read about. So I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
She said Max Ernst got divorced during the war while in France. And when Darian Fry came and freed a lot of the famous artists and politicians and writers and brought them to the US during World War II, the divorcee of Max Ernst could not come. So she wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt just said, sorry, no. So I wondered about that. The other thing I wondered about, second brief question, is you didn't mention Mrs. Roosevelt's good friend, Hick.
Okay, let me address the first thing first. She got literally thousands of those kinds of requests. I mean, literally, we have thousands and thousands of those sorts of things in our archive. She was constantly being asked, you know, can you interject here? Can you help here? Can you do this? Can you do that? She just couldn't. She was only one person. What she would generally try to do would be to direct people to where they needed to go for help, for assistance, you know, that sort of thing. So that was kind of the way she was able to do that, you know, to help individual people, when she had that flood of demand, was really very difficult to do. And her good friend Hick was a woman who she had met when she first started doing her press conferences. Hick was a newspaper reporter, and they became very good friends. And Hick actually got a job. I forget which exact agency. She worked with Harry Hopkins, and she went around and she did reporting on how sharecroppers were doing with some of the new programs and things that were going on with the New Deal. She and Mrs. Roosevelt became very close. They had a business for a short period of time called Valkill Industries, where they taught young people to make furniture and pewter, because the idea was that they had skills, you know, other than you know, just farming and that sort of stuff. And there are some people who say that the friendship was maybe more than just a friendship. We don't know that for a fact. There's speculation now. Lorena Hickok was a lesbian. She was out at that time, which was an important and brave thing to be. There are some, you know, speculation that, there might have been a little something more there, but we absolutely don't have any, it's all circumstantial evidence about that. And then later on, they had a little bit of a falling out, a little bit later on, as Mrs. Roosevelt became more actively involved in her own issues and her own capacity, it was more difficult for her to get things done because she didn't have the cover of the presidency, and so Hick was kind of pushing her to do things quicker, and she wasn't able to do things quick enough, and so there was some friction and some tension there as well. But they actually lived together. They had a small house at one point called Stone Cottage, which was a small cottage here on site. and that allowed them to get out of the big house, Sarah Roosevelt's house. And there were a number of people that kind of came. It was sort of like a flop house. You could, Mrs. Roosevelt was almost like a 1960s type of, come on in, stay for a couple of weeks, go out when you need, that sort of thing as well. So I didn't mean to neglect Hick. Certainly, we could also talk about, Francis Perkins or any number of other people, Mary Bethune, that Mrs. Roosevelt was involved with. So I didn't mean to exclude Hick, but I just didn't include her.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Does anybody else have any other questions? I don't see any hands up.
I do.
Oh, Fran,
Well, just,
go ahead.
Just a comment, because of having just listened to the book, that when Hick was on the road and there were things that it during the Depression, and she would let Eleanor know, Eleanor paid out of her own funds to help some of these people.
Yeah.
Wasn't he? That was just amazing. And then the other thing is that she brought in hobos from the street into the White House to spend the night.
Yeah.
This was all mind blowing.
Yeah, it's incredible. She really, the thing about Mrs. Roosevelt was because of the way she grew up, she really knew what it was like. Now, she should have had a wonderful life. She was born into a wealthy family, a very connected family. She had access to all that money and all that connection, and all that influence, even though she was an orphan. As soon as she came of age, she could have just, right into that lifestyle. But she understood what it was like to be an outsider. And that's part of the reason, people like Lorena Hickok, who was an outsider, given, the situation at the time, she brought outsiders in. She brought in hobos. She brought in the poor. She brought in children. She brought in refugees, because she knew what it was like not to have a voice. She knew what it was like not to be able to have an impact. And once she had a station in life and access to that very active president, she understood the importance of using that and working on that and working through that to get things done to help people. Up until now, this is shocking to people. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and you can't even go on the Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House anymore. Up until the morning of the attack at Pearl Harbor, the security parameter on the White House was the front door of the White House. So people used to go up and they would tack cards and notes to the front door of the White House, and Mrs. Roosevelt would go out and collect them, and maybe they were an invitation to a lunch or to, this or that. And sometimes she would call the person and say, oh yeah, I would love to attend or whatever. After Pearl Harbor, that's when it went out to the fence around the outside. But that's the way people felt. They felt connected to the Roosevelts. They felt like they could ask for that. Sometimes she did, pay out of her own pocket to help people and such, but she found that was really difficult to do, because then it became a thing of, well, how do I help this person and not help that person? And it created a lot of internal turmoil for her. Plus, she understood that, even if she gave away every penny she had, she couldn't help everybody. So by working through the various programs of the New Deal, the whole idea of relief, recovery, and reform, and all the various programs, the WPA, the Agro Adjustment Act, Civilian Conservation Corps, and all those sorts of things, she knew that the people were getting the help that they could get, and that it was sustainable. CCC was going to be active for years. It wasn't going to be like, okay, I'm going to write you a check and next week you're hungry again. Go get a job at the CCC and you will learn skills. You'll have 3 square meals a day. You'll have a safe place to eat or to sleep. And, it was that sort of a thing. But this is why, here we are over 60 years later, we're still talking about this person. Why? Because she was incredible. Right? She was a real inspiration. Was she perfect? No, nobody is. Did she screw up? Yes. Did she make mistakes? Yes. Were there things that, she probably shouldn't have done, or more things that she could have done? Absolutely. But the bottom line is she spent 78 years of her life trying to help other people better where they were in the world, not just in this country, not just in this state, but in the world, And when we have things like war crimes, when we have things like, atrocities and those sorts of things, how do you define what an atrocity is? How do you define what a war crime is? Well, you pull out your copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the things that you can and can't do, the things you're not supposed to do are listed right there. Now everybody's on record. You go ahead and you do it, but you're going to be held responsible for it. It may not happen overnight, but we're coming after you.
Dave, you have a question?
Can you talk a little bit about her career as an ambassador to the United Nations?
Yeah, mostly she was a big inspiration to the United Nations because, again, she had this mantle of President Roosevelt, right? This was a guy that was talking about the United Nations from the second week in the World War, and so there was very often a situation where it's kind of like when you have that hardest working person on the team and you're kind of like slouching off. You're like, well, I can't slouch off. The hardest working person is working hard. And she lifted everybody's spirit. She lifted everybody's call to service in what it was. She was so adamant about having the meetings for the committee, the Human Rights Committee, that the Human Rights Commission, the people on the committee actually began to complain that they were being worked too hard. And they said, Mrs. Roosevelt, we have human rights too, I'd like to get home to my kid's birthday, but you've got us here working till 7 o'clock at night. And she'd said, well, the needs of the people of the world bypass and surpass the needs of your child. You can say, happy birthday in the morning. When they complained that the meetings went too long, she had a solution for that. She said to the delegates, make shorter speeches. And there you go. So she was very instrumental. And when it came time, when Eisenhower won the presidency, she resigned her membership in the delegation because she wanted Eisenhower to be able to put in his own people. So she even recognized, okay, it's time for change, it's time for moving on.
Becky, did you have a question? You have to unmute yourself. So we still can't hear you. There you go.
All right, there's a new book out. It's called Firebrand and the First Lady. And I was thinking it was about Hick, but it's not. Can we talk a little about that book? It's supposed to be, after so many years, this came out, and it's about Eleanor Roosevelt.
I'm not familiar with the book. When did it come out?
I don't know, a few months ago, and it's about Polly Murray.
Yes, Polly Murray. Yeah. Okay. So she was a civil rights activist and a civil rights leader. She was married, but I think she identified as a lesbian. And so again, there's a whole, story with that and all this, and, but they were advocates for civil rights, and they were advocates for opening opportunities for women in workplaces, and especially for Black women in workplaces. I have not read the book, but I know that was Murray's role in the story of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was a contemporary of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mary Bethune McLeod, who were all working for obviously racial equality and more opportunity for African Americans in what was going on in the New Deal, because many of the New Deal programs were actually there was racism in some of these. Some of it was by accident, and some of it was on purpose. One of the things that President Roosevelt believed was that these programs could best be administered if they were administered locally, because you're going to know what your problem is, right? I don't pretend to know what your problem is sitting in Washington, but if you got it, you're out in the Northwest somewhere, you're going to know what your problem is. And you know how, like, in any town, there's that one family that's always getting everything done, right? And there's that other family in town that anytime anything goes wrong, the police go right there because they know they were probably involved with it. Well, that's the way Roosevelt believed. So he said, all right, let's get these things out into the communities where the best families that are going to get this stuff done, the people that are known as the mover and shakers, are going to get this stuff done. That worked in a lot of communities. In other communities, it didn't work so well because many of these people happen to be racist. And so some of the programs that they were doing that were designed to help people of color were being administered by people who had no interest in helping people of color. So in that situation, there was some inherent racism in the way that it was administered. There were also accidental racism, and that's not really a good term to use, but there was inadvertent. For example, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was designed to get farmers to grow less food so that the prices would go up, so farmers could get better prices, and that would allow them to keep their farms. Well, guess who owned the property? The property was owned by white farmers. Guess who worked the property? It tended to be people of color. So when the white farm owner is getting $1,000 to not plant 10,000 acres, those 10,000 acres are going unattended, and he lays off the people that were going to work there. And those tended to be the people of color. So the white owner is getting the $1,000 break, and the person of color is getting the pink slip. And that was an unintended consequence of that program. Mrs. Roosevelt worked to bring that to the president's attention, as did Harold Ickes, as did Pauly, as did Mary Bethune and those kinds of folks. And piece by piece, those were then addressed in the administration. Same thing with the WPA. The WPA, many of the people that were put in charge of hiring had no intention of hiring African Americans. So the idea was, look, you know what? On every WPA project, there has to be a certain number of African Americans on this project, or you don't get the government funding for the program. And so this opened up all kinds of high-paying, high-skilled jobs to people who would not have got the jobs ordinarily. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Hey, Katie, do you have any questions on your end before we wrap up? Doesn't look like it. Oh, there she is.
Oh,
But I can't hear it. No? Okay. No questions from the on-site viewing.
okay, great.
Okay, so
So
I know we ran over, but thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. I'm sorry to run over. The bottom line is, if you're looking for a good role model, Eleanor Roosevelt is a good role model. She's not a perfect role model. Nobody is. But we can learn a lot from her. We can learn that the problems that we have in our lives can be overcome. And sometimes the biggest problems we face can be turned into a turning point from which we can learn skills that can then help us to develop further along. And by doing that, by helping to make ourselves better, we can make other people's lives around us better as well by reaching out and helping them and pulling them along. We are all in this together, whether we like it or not, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we believe it or not. Anything that's helping is helping all of us. And things that are hurting are ultimately hurting all of us. Oh, thank you, Bill.
Sounds like a wonderful way to wrap up. And Jeff, as usual, we really love your presentations and your passion. And thank you for being a part of the Miro-West Center community.
Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.